When you close your eyes and think of the world's earliest civilizations, your thoughts may wander towards the dusty lands of the Near East, where rivers carved out valleys that could sustain human life. It is here, in Mesopotamia, often called the cradle of civilization, that both history and myth were born together. The word Mesopotamia itself comes from the Greek, meaning the land between rivers, and those rivers were none other than the mighty Tigris and Euphrates. Their waters flowed down from the mountains of Anatolia, winding and flooding into the plains that would eventually give rise to the earliest cities known to humankind. Yet this story, the story you are about to hear in gentle detail, is not simply the account of irrigation ditches, brick walls, and the trade of barley. It is also the story of gods, of the myths that explained the rains, the floods, the stars above, and the mysterious cycles of death and rebirth. In Mesopotamia, myth and reality were not two separate things. They were entwined like reeds woven into a mat. Every temple was both a place of worship and a center of economics. Every offering to a god was both an act of faith and a political necessity. And every tale told of the gods was a reflection of human struggles with survival, order, and fate. To begin with Mesopotamian mythology is to step into a world where the ordinary and the divine were inseparable. You will find that the humdrum details of farming, counting sheep, and measuring grain flow naturally into the worship of Enlil, Anu, Inanna, and Marduk. The gods were thought of as landlords, and the people as their tenants, bound to keep them pleased, for if the gods were ignored, famine, war, and flood would surely follow. And so the mythology of Mesopotamia can never be separated from the weight of daily survival. The oldest myths come to us from the Sumerians, the first people to shape city life in southern Mesopotamia around 3000 BCE. In their myths, you encounter the high god Anu, lord of the heavens, Enlil, the god of wind and storms, Enki, lord of the waters and of wisdom, and Inanna, goddess of love, war, and power. These deities were not distant or abstract. They were thought of to live in great temples at the heart of each city, housed within shrines, their statues clothed, fed, and honored as though they were rulers in their own right. If you imagine the people of Ur or Uruk walking by torchlight to bring offerings to their temples, you begin to sense the atmosphere of the time. It was not only the fear of crop failure or military defeat that guided their rituals, but also the belief that the gods were deeply intertwined with their fates. Every clay tablet inscribed with cuneiform signs carries fragments of these myths, scratched into wet clay and baked hard, so that thousands of years later you can still hold in your hand the stories once whispered by priests and kings. One of the most important themes in Mesopotamian mythology is the struggle between order and chaos. The world was thought to have emerged out of the waters of chaos, shaped by divine beings into something habitable, but always at risk of slipping back into disorder. You see this clearly in the Babylonian creation myth, the Enuma Elish. In that tale, the world is born out of a battle between younger gods and the primordial chaos dragon Tiamat, a figure of saltwater and destruction. Marduk, the champion god of Babylon, slays Tiamat, splits her body in two, and fashions the heavens and the earth from her remains. Thus creation is not a gentle act, but one born out of conflict, an imposition of order upon chaos. And yet for the people living along the rivers, this myth resonated deeply. Each year the Tigris and Euphrates could flood unpredictably, destroying fields and homes. The balance between survival and destruction was always precarious. Just as Marduk had to slay Tiamat to create a habitable world, so too did the people of Mesopotamia have to battle the waters, the droughts, and the shifting fortunes of nature to preserve their existence. But mythology was not only about beginnings. It also addressed the mysteries of life and death. In Sumerian myth, The goddess Inanna descends to the underworld, ruled by her sister Ereshkigal, queen of the dead. Stripped of her garments and power at each gate, Inanna eventually hangs lifeless on a hook in the underworld, only to be revived later. This tale reflects the cycle of fertility, the planting of seeds in the soil, their apparent death beneath the earth, and their eventual rebirth as crops in the new season. To the Mesopotamians, the myths of gods were never abstract. They mirrored the endless cycles of planting and harvest, life and decay. If you picture the weary farmer watching the barley sprout in the spring, you might imagine him thinking of Inanna's return from death. When he places offerings at the shrine, he is not only thanking the gods, but ensuring that the delicate rhythm of the world continues. In this way, mythology served as both explanation and reassurance. Daily life, too, was permeated with myth. The king himself was considered chosen by the gods, his authority flowing from divine approval. But unlike the eternal gods, kings were mortal, and their legitimacy could crumble if famine struck or armies invaded. Thus, many myths feature humans striving for immortality or seeking favor from the gods. You can see this most famously in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the great tale of the king of Uruk who sought everlasting life. His journey, his friendship with Enkidu, and his eventual acceptance of mortality reveal how Mesopotamian mythology wrestled with questions that remain familiar to you today. What it means to be human, what it means to die, and how to live with dignity in the face of inevitability. As you listen, you may feel the slow unfolding of this ancient world where every myth was a reflection of survival, and every act of survival was tied to myth. But we are only at the beginning of this journey, only at the first steps into the landscape of gods and humans, temples and fields, clay and stone. You have met the rivers, the gods, and the first myths of creation and descent, but much remains unexplored. For how, you might ask, did these stories change as cities rose and fell, as Sumer gave way to Akkad, as Babylon ascended? How did the myths reflect shifting powers and shifting fears? And what might you discover as you move deeper into the cycles of these stories about the way human beings once made sense of the world? The stories of Mesopotamia were not meant to be recited once and forgotten. They were repeated endlessly, inscribed on clay tablets, copied by generations of scribes, whispered in temples, and retold in the glow of firelight. Over time, these myths grew into long cycles, not unlike the planting seasons they reflected, and each retelling added new weight to the memory of a people who measured their lives against the power of their gods. One of the most extraordinary cycles to emerge was the story of Gilgamesh, a figure who may once have been a real king of Uruk, but whose memory was shaped and enlarged until he became a hero of myth. The Epic of Gilgamesh is perhaps the oldest surviving great work of literature. It is written in Akkadian on clay tablets, pieced together from fragments scattered across ruins, some broken, others preserved by chance. When you hear his story, you are stepping into words that were already ancient, 2,000 years before the birth of Christ. Gilgamesh is presented as a mighty ruler, 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, his strength unmatched, his will unchecked. And yet, this mixture of divinity and mortality is a curse as much as a gift. The people of Uruk, exhausted by his tyranny, cried out to the gods for relief, and the gods responded by creating Enkidu, a wild man who lived among animals, drinking with gazelles, eating grass, untouched by the structures of civilization. The meeting of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, after an initial clash, turned into one of the greatest friendships of mythology. Together, they set out on adventures, slaying Humbaba, the monstrous guardian of the cedar forest, and killing the bull of heaven sent by the goddess Ishtar, who had been spurned by Gilgamesh.
But divine wrath is never far away in Mesopotamian stories. For killing the bull of heaven, Enkidu was condemned to die, and his death cast Gilgamesh into despair. Here you see the central theme of the epic unfold, the confrontation with mortality. Even a king, even one touched by divinity, could not escape death. It is in this grief that Gilgamesh set out on a quest for immortality. He wandered beyond the borders of the known world through mountains and seas in search of Utnapishtim, a figure who had survived the Great Flood and been granted eternal life by the gods. The flood story told to Gilgamesh mirrors closely the biblical tale of Noah, with striking parallels: a divine warning, the building of a great boat, the preservation of life, and the release of birds to find dry land. But in the Mesopotamian telling, Utnapishtim's immortality is unique, never to be granted to another. When Gilgamesh finally finds him, he is told a hard truth. Humans are destined to die, and to seek immortality is to chase the wind. Still, Utnapishtim offers a test. If Gilgamesh can stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights, he will prove himself worthy. Yet Gilgamesh, weary from his long journey, falls asleep almost instantly. He is then given one final chance, told of a plant that could restore youth. But even this hope is snatched away, for as he bathes in a river, a serpent steals the plant and slithers away, leaving him with nothing but the knowledge that his fate is no different than any other man's. The Epic of Gilgamesh ends not in triumph, but in acceptance. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk, standing upon its mighty walls, reflecting not on his failed quest for immortality, but on the city that he had built, the society that endures beyond any individual life. The message is clear. Though you cannot live forever, the works of your hands, the bonds you form, and the cities you build are the legacy that outlasts you. For the Mesopotamians, this was a deeply resonant truth. Mortality was inescapable, but civilization itself was a form of immortality. While Gilgamesh's story explored the human confrontation with death, the myths of Inanna, later known as Ishtar, explored cycles of life, power, and rebirth. Among her many myths, the most striking is her descent into the underworld. Inanna, queen of heaven and goddess of love, resolved to visit the realm of her sister, Ereshkigal, who ruled over the land of the dead. At each of the 7 gates of the underworld, she was forced to remove one item of clothing or jewelry until she arrived naked and powerless before Ereshkigal. Stripped of her divine authority, Inanna was judged, struck down, and hung lifeless upon a hook. The world above was thrown into disarray, for with her absence, fertility ceased, and life seemed to wither. Only through the intervention of Enki, the god of wisdom, was she restored. But even then, her return required that another be sent to the underworld in her place. Inanna chose her consort, Dumuzi, who seemed ungrateful for her restoration, and thus he was carried off. But through compromise, it was decided that Dumuzi would spend half the year in the underworld and the other half among the living, a clear reflection of the seasonal cycles of death and rebirth in the natural world. The descent of Inanna is both haunting and symbolic. It tells of power humbled, of death as an unavoidable passage, and of the possibility of renewal. To the people of Mesopotamia, whose crops died and rose again with the seasons, this was no abstract metaphor, but a reality woven into their survival. Each year the rivers flooded, each year the fields demanded sowing, and each year life and death intertwined in a fragile dance. Taken together, the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Descent of Inanna offer you 2 central visions of Mesopotamian myth: the personal struggle against mortality and the cosmic cycle of death and renewal. Both stories are deeply human. Both carry the sense of melancholy that comes from accepting limits, yet also the quiet reassurance that life, even in its brevity, has meaning. If you sit with these stories, you may notice how they reflect the concerns of their time, but also how they mirror your own. You too live with the awareness of death, with the cycles of change, with the search for meaning in a world that often seems fragile. And as the Mesopotamians once looked to their myths to guide them through, so too can you hear in them an echo of your own struggles and hopes. But what of the other myths? What of the other gods who filled the pantheon of Mesopotamia? What of Enlil, who once granted kingship and commanded storms? What of Enki, whose cleverness shaped the order of the cosmos? And how did these myths change as power shifted from city to city, from Sumer to Akkad, from Akkad to Babylon? These questions lead naturally onward, for the mythology of Mesopotamia is not a single tale, but a vast river of stories, always flowing, always reshaping itself. And so, as we leave behind Gilgamesh's weary return and Inanna's perilous descent, you are left with the thought of what comes next. The unfolding of a mythology that spans millennia, and whose echoes continue to shape the myths and religions that came after.
When you think of mythology, it is easy to imagine distant tales carved in stone, or stories told around a fire, disconnected from daily life. Yet in Mesopotamia, mythology was not a separate sphere. It was the air people breathed, the framework by which they explained everything: why the rivers flooded, why kings ruled, why illness struck, and why life itself was so fragile. The gods were not abstractions, they were immediate, woven into every harvest, every law, every prayer muttered in the shadow of a temple wall. The heart of this system lay in the great pantheon of gods, each with their own roles, domains, and temperaments. At its highest sat Anu, the god of the heavens, remote and often silent, who embodied the unreachable sky. Beneath him was Enlil, the god of air and storms, fierce and commanding, who could bring fertility through rain, but also devastation through tempest. Enlil's word was law, and it was said that kingship itself was his gift to humankind. Then there was Enki, or Ea, as he was later known, the god of wisdom, water, and creation. Unlike the stern Enlil, Enki was subtle and clever, a problem solver who often acted as a benefactor to humanity. His realm was the subterranean waters, the Apsu, from which all life flowed. If Enlil was feared for his power, Enki was trusted for his ingenuity. Many myths speak of him intervening to save humankind from destruction, even finding loopholes in the decrees of other gods. Among the goddesses, none loomed larger than Inanna, already glimpsed in her descent to the underworld. She was love and war, passion and fury, a figure of immense complexity. Worship of her was especially intense in Uruk, where she embodied both fertility and destruction. To pray to Inanna was to ask for abundance, but also to court danger, for she was as unpredictable as the shifting rivers. And always present in the background was Ninhursag, the mother goddess, linked to the earth itself, and Shamash, the sun god and bringer of justice, whose light illuminated truth and falsehood alike. Later came Marduk, patron god of Babylon, who would rise to prominence in a new age, carrying with him a story of order born from chaos. These gods were not worshipped in isolation. They were believed to reside in temples, or more specifically, in the statues and images carefully maintained by priests. A temple was not simply a place of prayer, it was a house, a literal dwelling for the god. Priests bathed, dressed, and fed the divine statues each day, offering bread, beer, and meat as though the gods themselves were seated at the table. Rituals of cleansing, anointing, and music ensured that the divine presence remained, for a neglected god could abandon its temple, leaving a city vulnerable. The largest of these temples were called ziggurats, vast stepped towers rising above the flat plains. Each level was carefully constructed, symbolizing a link between the heavens, the earth, and the underworld. At the top, a shrine housed the god's image. From a distance, a ziggurat looked like a mountain,
perhaps a deliberate attempt to recreate the sacred heights in a land that otherwise stretched flat to the horizon. To ascend its steps was symbolically to climb closer to the realm of the gods, an act of devotion both physical and spiritual. Yet for ordinary people, mythology entered their lives in smaller, humbler ways. A farmer planting barley in the soft silt after the floods might whisper a prayer to Enki for water, or to Enlil for favorable winds. A mother might wear a clay amulet inscribed with protective spells against demons who were believed to prowl the night. Merchants, setting out along dusty roads, sought Shamish's blessing for fair dealings and safe passage. Even illness was understood in divine terms. A fever might be seen as the touch of a malevolent spirit, to be driven out by charms, incantations, or the intervention of a god through prayer. Mythology also shaped the structure of society itself. Kingship, for instance, was considered a divine trust. The Sumerian king list, a remarkable document preserved on clay tablets, records rulers stretching back into mythical antiquity, some said to reign for thousands of years. Though clearly exaggerated, the list was not meant to be literal. It demonstrated that the right to rule descended from heaven itself. Kings were not gods, but they were chosen by them, serving as mediators between the divine and the human. In practice, this meant that every royal act, building a canal, declaring a law, waging a war, was framed in religious language. A king might proclaim that Enlil had granted him power to restore order, or that Inanna had favored him in battle. Even legal codes, such as the famous Code of Hammurabi, began with prologues invoking divine authority. Justice was not a human invention, it was handed down from the gods, embodied in the blazing sun of Shamash. If you could walk through a Mesopotamian city at dusk, you would sense how myth and life intertwined. The streets, narrow and winding, would echo with the braying of donkeys and the chatter of market stalls closing for the night. Clay lamps would flicker in doorways, filling the alleys with the scent of smoke. In the courtyards of temples, priests would be offering food to statues lit by the golden glow of oil lamps. In homes built of mud brick, families might whisper protective prayers before sleeping, their faith as much a part of survival as the bread they ate or the water they drank. The gods were not remote figures, distant and aloof. They were present in the smallest detail, from the rise of the morning sun to the turn of a potter's wheel. In a land where the rivers could bless with fertility or curse with flood, where drought or invasion could strike without warning, to believe in the gods was not merely a choice, it was the only way to make sense of the fragile thread of existence. And yet, even as these myths gave comfort, they also contained a note of unease. The gods were powerful, yes, but they were not always kind. They could be fickle, demanding, and harsh. A prayer might be answered, or it might not be. An offering might win favor, or it might fall into silence. The Mesopotamian worldview was one of humility before forces greater than oneself, an acceptance that life was never fully secure and that human striving must always reckon with divine will. It is here, in this blend of devotion and uncertainty, that we see the essence of Mesopotamian mythology, a constant negotiation between human effort and divine decree, between the everyday and the eternal. And as you listen, perhaps you notice that these themes, though ancient, are not entirely unfamiliar. You too live with uncertainties beyond your control, with forces of chance and change that shape your life. Like the people of Mesopotamia, you seek patterns, meanings, and rituals to steady your days. But how did these myths evolve as empires rose and fell? How did the Sumerian gods of Uruk and Ur become the Babylonian gods of Hammurabi's age, and later the Assyrian deities who thundered from Nineveh? The answers lie in the next stage of the journey. For now, you can rest in the quiet hum of life in a Mesopotamian city, where mythology is not distant but immediate, where the gods dwell among clay and firelight, and every dawn and dusk is a reminder of humanity's place beneath the gaze of powers unseen.
The story of Mesopotamian mythology is not static. Like the waters of the Tigris and Euphrates, it flowed and changed, carrying with it silt from many ages. What began in the city-states of Sumer, with their pantheon of ancient gods, would be reshaped by conquest, adaptation, and the long endurance of memory. To trace this journey is to see how stories survive, not by remaining fixed, but by transforming with each generation. In the earliest written myths, composed in Sumerian, the gods were local yet vast. Each city-state had its own patron deity, whose temple anchored the life of the community. In Uruk, Inanna reigned supreme, her temple rising as a center of both worship and trade. In Nippur, it was Enlil, storm lord and lawgiver. In Eridu, the watery wisdom of Enki held sway. Cities were not simply political units, they were sacred landscapes, with their fortunes tied to the favor of their patron gods. But as Sumerian city-states gave way to larger empires, a shift occurred. With the rise of Akkad in the 24th century BCE, under the rule of Sargon of Akkad, the first true empire in history emerged. And with empire came a new question. How could one pantheon of many local gods serve a realm that stretched across diverse peoples and cities? The answer was not to discard the old deities, but to weave them into a broader tapestry. The Akkadian language, which gradually supplanted Sumerian as the common tongue, carried the myths into a new form. In Akkadian versions, the names of gods were sometimes changed, but their characters remained recognizable. Inanna became Ishtar, still goddess of love and war, but her tales now carried a new edge, reflecting the imperial ambitions of Akkad. She was no longer just the goddess of a single city. She became a figure whose power spanned empires, invoked by kings who sought to justify their rule through her favor. The Akkadian scribes also preserved the Epic of Gilgamesh, shaping it into the form that would endure for centuries. Gilgamesh, once a Sumerian king of Uruk, became a mythic hero whose story resonated far beyond its local roots. His grief, his longing for immortality, his quest across the earth, these were no longer just tales of one city. They became parables for the human condition itself. And yet, in every version, you can still glimpse the Sumerian heart beating beneath the Akkadian retelling. The memory of clay tablets inscribed long before Sargon's empire. Perhaps the most dramatic reshaping came with the rise of Babylon, centuries later. Here, in the first dynasty of Babylon, a new god emerged into prominence, Marduk. Unlike the older deities who had deep roots in the city-states of Sumer, Marduk's rise was tied directly to political power. As Babylon grew from a modest town into a dominant kingdom under Hammurabi, so too did Marduk rise from a minor deity to the head of the pantheon. This ascent was cemented in the great creation epic known as the Enuma Elish, likely composed in the 2nd millennium BCE. In this myth, the universe itself begins in chaos, in the mingling of fresh and salt waters, Apsu and Tiamat. From their union sprang younger gods whose struggles eventually led to war. In this cosmic battle, it was Marduk who triumphed, slaying the dragon-like Tiamat and fashioning the world from her divided body. From one half he made the heavens, from the other the earth. It is a striking shift. In older Sumerian tales, creation is often gradual, tied to the ordering of waters and the work of divine hands. But in the Babylonian vision, creation comes through conflict, through the victory of one god over primordial chaos. This reflected not only mythic imagination, but also political reality. Babylon's rise was not peaceful. It was forged through conquest, and so too was its god supremacy. Marduk's triumph over Tiamat was mirrored in the king's triumphs over rival cities. Myth became the language of empire. Yet notice how the old was never entirely erased. Even as Marduk rose, Enlil, Enki, Inanna and others remained present, their cults maintained, their temples tended. The pantheon was vast, and there was room for continuity as well as change.
Myths were layered, with Sumerian versions lying beneath Akkadian and Babylonian retellings like sediment on the riverbed. To study them is to peel back strata of belief, each one revealing both what was preserved and what was reinterpreted. These shifts also shaped ritual life. In Babylon, the New Year festival, or Akitu, became one of the most important religious events. It was not simply a celebration of renewal, but a cosmic drama reenacted each year. Priests would recite the Enuma Elish, retelling Marduk's victory over Tiamat, reminding the people that order triumphed over chaos, that the king's rule mirrored the god's divine authority. Through ritual, myth became living truth, binding the community to its gods and its rulers alike. Even in private life, the changes in mythology seeped into personal devotion. Where once a farmer might pray mainly to Enki for water, now prayers to Marduk for protection and healing were widespread. Clay tablets from later Babylonian periods include spells and incantations calling upon Marduk as the savior from illness and misfortune. Ishtar, too, remained a powerful goddess, her dual nature as love and war making her both feared and beloved. She was invoked in battle, in passion, in fertility, and in grief. And then came the Assyrians, heirs to this long tradition, who ruled from their capitals at Nineveh and Ashur. In their hands, mythology took yet another form. Their chief god, Ashur, was elevated in a manner similar to Marduk, becoming the embodiment of the Assyrian state itself. In Assyrian art, you can see winged figures, lions and sacred trees, symbols that blend myth and kingship into a visual theology of empire. Through all of these transitions, one truth remains. Mesopotamian mythology endured because it adapted. The gods could be renamed, their stories reshaped, their roles reinterpreted, but the essence of divine presence remained constant. The people still looked to the heavens and the underworld, still offered food to statues, still sought meaning in the shifting fortunes of rivers and kings. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the voices of the scribes, bent over their clay tablets, pressing cuneiform signs into wet clay. They were not merely recording, they were preserving, reshaping, carrying memory forward into new ages. Each retelling was both an act of reverence and an assertion of identity. By writing the Enuma Elish, by copying the Epic of Gilgamesh, they ensured that the old stories lived on, even as new gods rose and new empires spread across the land. But what does this tell us about mythology itself? Is it fixed truth, handed down from age to age, or is it something more fluid, more adaptive, a mirror that shifts with the needs of each generation? And if that is so, how much of the Mesopotamian mythology we know today is Sumerian at its core, and how much is the voice of Babylon and Assyria layered on top? These questions linger, unresolved, as we prepare to move deeper still. For in the next stage, we will turn from the great gods and empires to the shadowed realms of the underworld, where myths of death, judgment, and afterlife reveal a darker side of Mesopotamian belief, one that shaped not only rituals of mourning, but the very way people understood their fleeting existence.
If the temples and festivals of Mesopotamia spoke of life and order, then the underworld whispered of endings. For in Mesopotamian belief, no matter how mighty a king, no matter how devout a farmer, all were destined eventually to walk the path beneath the earth. Unlike some later traditions that imagined bright heavens or eternal punishments, the Mesopotamian underworld was more even-handed. It was not so much a place of reward or punishment, as it was a shadowed continuation of existence. The realm of the dead was known by many names: Kur, Irkalla, or simply the land of no return. It lay beneath the world of the living, a vast cavern where the souls of the dead, called Giddim, dwelled in silence and dust.
To enter it was to leave behind sunlight, family, and joy, stepping into a world where food was ashes and drink was clay. At the heart of this realm ruled Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld. Unlike her sister Inanna, who strode through the upper world in splendor, Ereshkigal's throne was one of solitude and inevitability. Her consort in different tales was either Gugalana, the bull of heaven, or later Nergal, a god of war and plague who descended to become her husband. Together, they presided over the fates of the dead, though it was Ereshkigal's authority that was absolute. The gates of the underworld were guarded, each one demanding that the soul, or even a god, surrender a piece of themselves to pass through. In the most famous myth of descent, that of Inanna's journey to the underworld, the goddess of love and war sets out to visit her sister. Whether out of rivalry, duty, or ambition, she descends. But at each of the 7 gates she is stripped, her crown, her jewels, her robes, her weapons, until she stands naked and powerless before Ereshkigal's throne. There, Inanna is judged and struck down, hung like a corpse upon a hook. For 3 days and 3 nights she remains in the realm of death, while the upper world falters without her presence. Crops wither, fertility wanes, war lies suspended. It is only through the cunning of Enki, who sends strange, genderless beings to rescue her, that Inanna returns to life. But her return comes at a price. She must send another in her place. And so begins the tale of Dumuzi, her husband, chosen as the one to descend, leading to the cycle of seasonal death and rebirth. This myth tells us much about Mesopotamian thought. The underworld was not only a place of finality, it was also woven into the cycles of the earth itself. The death of Dumuzi was reflected in the withering of fields each summer, while his return brought renewal. The descent of Inanna echoed the journey of all souls, yet her return offered a hint, however faint, of hope that life and death were bound together in an eternal rhythm. But for ordinary people, the underworld was not symbolic. It was the inescapable end. Archaeological finds give us small glimpses into their fears and preparations. Graves often included food, drink, and small offerings, as though to ease the journey. In some burial sites, clay vessels with traces of beer or bread were found, reminders that the dead were thought to continue needing sustenance, even if it turned to dust in their hands. Family obligations did not end with burial. The living were expected to care for their ancestors through rituals known as the kispu, offerings of food and drink given regularly at household shrines or graves. Neglecting these duties risked angering the spirits, who might return as restless giddim, bringing illness or misfortune. Thus, remembrance was not optional. It was a duty woven into the very rhythm of life, binding the living and the dead together in mutual dependence. The underworld itself was imagined as stratified. While all souls shared in its dust, some texts hint at distinctions. Those with proper burials rested more peacefully, while the unburied wandered in torment. Warriors fallen in battle, if unremembered, were restless, while those honored with rituals could find some measure of peace. Yet even the most honored did not escape the shadow. There was no paradise awaiting them, only a quieter existence in the land beneath. To grasp this fully, imagine for a moment being a farmer in Mesopotamia. You live by the river's flood, by the toil of your hands, by the favor of the gods. At night, you hear the jackals and the desert winds, reminders of fragility. You know that when death comes, you will not rise to a shining heaven. You will join your ancestors in the dark, a place of silence and memory. The only hope lies in the care of your children, who will pour beer into the earth for you, keeping your name alive through ritual. The fear of being forgotten was perhaps greater than the fear of dying itself. To die without family, without ritual, was to vanish into misery. To be remembered was to endure, if only in the dust-filled halls of Ereshkigal. In this way, the Mesopotamian underworld reveals not only a theology, but a human truth, that memory and care from the living shaped the fate of the dead. The myths of descent and return also hint at a deeper cultural recognition, that death was not only an end to be escaped, but a cycle to be accepted. Inanna descends, Dumuzi dies, crops wither, rains return, and the world is renewed. Human life mirrored this rhythm, each generation following the last, each burial linking the living to the land beneath. But what might it have felt like to actually believe in this land of no return? To imagine yourself walking down its shadowed corridors, leaving behind all you knew, to sit forever on dust and clay. Was it a source of dread or of calm acceptance? Did the annual rituals ease that fear, or only remind the living of their own inevitable journey? These questions rest heavily, like the weight of earth upon a tomb, and it is with them that we pause here. For the underworld is vast, and in the next part we will descend deeper still into the stories of Nergal, of restless spirits, and of the intricate rituals the Mesopotamians devised to keep the boundary between life and death in place.
When you picture the Mesopotamian underworld, it is easy to imagine only stillness and silence. But the myths and rituals hint at something far more restless, a fragile balance that needed constant attention. The dead could be appeased, honored, and sustained, but if forgotten or insulted, they could also rise in resentment. The boundary between the living and the underworld was porous, requiring both gods and humans to guard it with care. One of the figures who embodied this uneasy balance was Nergal, a god of paradoxes. In some myths, he is a force of destruction, the god of war, pestilence, and scorching heat, a being whose very presence meant death. Yet in others, he is drawn down into the underworld, where he becomes the consort of Ereshkigal, the queen of the dead. The tale of Nergal's descent begins with a banquet of the gods. Messengers are sent to invite each deity, but when the invitation reaches the underworld, Ereshkigal cannot attend. Instead, she sends her vizier, Namtar, to represent her. When Namtar arrives, all the gods rise to greet him, except for Nergal, who scorns the envoy of the underworld. Insulted, Ereshkigal demands that he be punished. Nergal is sent down to apologize, but his descent is accompanied by gifts of power and cunning advice. He passes through the gates armed with strength, and when he reaches Ereshkigal's throne, he either threatens or seduces her, depending on the version of the myth. In one, he overpowers her and seizes control, ruling at her side as her equal. In another, he spends 6 days and nights with her in passion, then tries to leave only for her desperate cries to call him back. Either way, Nergal becomes a ruler of the underworld, embodying both violence and intimacy, conquest and binding. This tale reflects more than myth. It reflects the ancient reality that the underworld was never entirely separate from life. War, disease, and drought were seen as eruptions of death into the living world. Nergal, with his dual roles, was a reminder that death was not only an ending, but a force that could arrive suddenly, tearing through families and cities, leaving emptiness in its wake. And yet, the dead themselves were not silent. The Mesopotamians believed in the giddim, the ghostly shades of those who had passed on. If they were honored properly, these spirits remained in their place, sustained by offerings. But if they were neglected, forgotten, or denied burial, they might return. The giddim could slip into homes, bringing illness, nightmares, or misfortune. They were not vengeful demons by nature, but restless, hungry, aching for the care that was their due. To prevent this, families performed kispu rituals. At regular intervals, monthly or on special festival days, food and drink were offered to the ancestors. Beer, bread, dates, and water were common offerings. The family might pour libations into the earth or set out bowls at household shrines. These were not grand feasts, but quiet, solemn gestures. To pour beer for the dead was not merely symbolic. It was believed to nourish their shades, to give them a measure of comfort in the dusty halls of Irkalla. For those without family, the situation was more dire. The unburied, the forgotten, the stranger. These souls were thought to wander in perpetual hunger. Texts describe them clawing at the doors of the living, demanding sustenance. They were the figures most feared, for without descendants to remember them, they pressed upon the boundaries of life, hungry and unresolved. Priests and exorcists offered remedies for such dangers. Incantations, ritual objects, and offerings could appease the restless dead or banish them back to the underworld. Clay figurines might be buried as substitutes, offerings placed at crossroads, or protective charms hung at the threshold of the home. In this way, ritual maintained the barrier between the two worlds, a fragile wall that had to be renewed again and again. Even kings were not immune. Royal inscriptions often included prayers to the gods of the underworld, seeking to ensure peace not only for their reigns, but for their afterlives. Great rulers built elaborate tombs, stocked with provisions, weapons, and treasures, hoping that their status in life would carry over into death. Yet even these kings acknowledged that the underworld was the great equalizer. The Epic of Gilgamesh reminds us of this as the hero himself laments that no matter one's deeds, all must eventually sit in the dust. The Epic of Gilgamesh, in fact, gives us a poignant glimpse of the underworld in the story of Enkidu's ghost. After Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh seeks knowledge of the afterlife. Through ritual and prayer, he manages to speak with Enkidu's spirit. What he hears is sobering. The afterlife is bleak, filled with shadows and dust. Only those who were well remembered, buried with care, and tended by many descendants found any measure of comfort. The forgotten languished, their spirits ragged and unsatisfied. This emphasis on memory and ritual reveals a society profoundly aware of continuity. The living carried responsibility not only for themselves, but for their ancestors. To neglect the dead was to risk disorder in both worlds. To honor them was to maintain the balance of life. And yet, one cannot help but wonder, did these rituals ease the fear of death or deepen it? Did the monthly offering remind families of the love that endured beyond death, or of the relentless truth that all would one day need such offerings themselves? The Mesopotamian underworld, with its shadowy halls, its queen Ereshkigal, its uneasy ruler Nergal, and its restless giddim, reflects a vision of death that was not glorious, but inevitable, intimate, and deeply human.
If the underworld spoke of endings, then the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, spoke of beginnings. The title itself comes from its opening words, "when on high," a reminder that these myths were preserved in poetic form, recited aloud during great festivals, particularly the New Year celebrations in Babylon. The Enuma Elish was not just entertainment, it was a ritual recitation, a reminder of cosmic order, power, and divine authority. The story begins with a primordial silence. Before the gods, before earth, before the great cities of the two rivers, there were only the mingled waters, Apsu, the fresh waters, and Tiamat, the salt waters. Together they were the raw potential of existence, swirling in formless unity. From their mingling came the first gods, young and restless, who filled the silence with their movement and noise. But harmony was fleeting. Apsu, disturbed by the clamor of these younger gods, plotted their destruction. Tiamat, however, hesitated, torn between her loyalty to her offspring and her bond with Apsu. When Apsu was slain by the god Ea, and Tiamat saw her partner's lifeless form, grief turned to fury. She took on the role of avenger, raising an army of monsters, dragons, serpents, and storm beasts, to wage war on her children. It was in this moment of crisis that Marduk, the youthful warrior god of Babylon, emerged as a champion. He agreed to face Tiamat, but only on the condition that he be made ruler among the gods. They consented, crowning him with sovereignty and arming him with a bow, a net, and a great storm. The battle between Marduk and Tiamat became one of the most enduring images of Mesopotamian myth. With his net, he trapped her, with his bow he pierced her belly, and with his storm he crushed her form. But he did not discard her body. He used it. Splitting her in two, he stretched one half to form the sky, and pressed the other into the earth. From her carcass, the ordered world was shaped. The rivers, the mountains, the winds, all were born from the remnants of Tiamat. Her defeat was not just destruction, but transformation. Chaos made into order, silence given shape and form. And so, the world was not merely a gift of the gods, but the remains of a slain monster. A reminder that creation and violence, life and death, were bound together. Yet the Enuma Elish did not stop with the shaping of the earth. It turned to the question of humanity. Why, the story asks, did humans exist? In the myth, the gods who had fought with Tiamat grew weary of their labors. They had built the heavens, secured the earth, and fashioned the rivers. But the burden of maintenance was heavy. To ease their toil, Marduk proposed a new creation. From the blood of Kingu, the commander of Tiamat's monstrous host, humanity was formed. Mixed with clay, his blood gave humans life, but also a debt. For humans were not created for freedom. They were created to serve. Their purpose was to tend the temples, to offer sacrifices, to sustain the gods with worship and labor. To the Mesopotamians, this was not an insult, but a duty. To serve the gods was to live in alignment with the order of the universe. To neglect them was to risk disaster, famine, flood, or invasion. The human role was both humble and vital, binding heaven and earth together through ritual, prayer, and work. So you can imagine then the significance of reciting the Enuma Elish each new year in Babylon. As the king and priests led the ceremonies, they were not merely telling a story, they were reenacting creation itself. Each recitation renewed the cosmic order, reaffirmed Marduk's sovereignty, and reminded the people of their place in the grand design. It was history, myth, and ritual woven into one. But not all Mesopotamian creation stories were the same. Earlier traditions from Sumer tell of other gods shaping humanity. In one tale, it is Enki and the mother goddess Ninhursag who mold clay figures and breathe life into them. In another, humanity emerges not from divine blood but from the fertile earth itself. These differences reveal how myths shifted over time, adapting to the rise and fall of cities, dynasties, and priesthoods. Yet across all versions, one theme remains. Humanity is bound to service. Whether shaped from clay or blood, whether by Enki's wisdom or Marduk's command, people exist to maintain the link between earth and heaven. Work, worship, and ritual are not burdens, but the very essence of existence. It is worth pausing here to consider how ordinary people might have heard these stories. Imagine a farmer sitting by a fire after a long day in the fields, hearing the recitation during a festival. To him, the tale of Marduk's triumph was not abstract. It explained why the world had rivers, why storms raged across the plains, why temples demanded offerings, and why kings claimed authority. The myth gave shape to his reality, turning the back-breaking labor of irrigation and the endless cycle of planting and harvest into part of a divine order. Yet in these myths lingered deeper, more unsettling truths. If the world was born from the corpse of Tiamat, then life itself rested upon death. If humans were shaped from the blood of Kingu, then every breath carried the memory of rebellion crushed and chaos subdued. In serving the gods, humans were also serving the remnants of that violent beginning. So what did it mean truly to be human in Mesopotamian thought? Were people grateful servants, fulfilling their place in the order of things? Or were they prisoners of a destiny written in divine blood and clay?
If the creation stories explained how the world came into being, then the myths of kingship explained how it was sustained. For in the eyes of Mesopotamians, kings were not merely men, they were bridges between the divine and the mortal, the ones chosen to uphold the order that Marduk and the other gods had set into place. Kingship was itself considered a gift from heaven. The Sumerians described it as something that descended from the heavens after the flood, bestowed upon cities in turn. The king was not divine in the same way as the gods, but he carried divine authority, a steward of cosmic order on earth. Without him, society risked sliding into chaos, the very chaos represented by Tiamat in the Enuma Elish. Consider the role of the king during the Akitu festival, the Babylonian New Year celebration, when the Enuma Elish was recited. During the rituals, the king's authority was tested. In fact, there was a moment of deliberate humiliation. The high priest would strip the king of his regalia, slap him across the face, and forced him to kneel before the statue of Marduk. Only after this ritual abasement could the king be restored to his throne, symbolically proving that his authority was not his own, but granted by the god. This was no mere theater. It was the reaffirmation that kingship itself was divine in origin, a fragile gift contingent on service to the gods. The temples, too, were extensions of this cosmic order. Each city was centered on its ziggurat, a stepped temple rising above the flat plains like a mountain built of clay and brick. These structures were not just places of worship. They were seen as cosmic junctions, points where heaven and earth met. Priests tended the daily rituals inside, offering food, incense, and prayer to the gods. But the labor that sustained them extended far beyond the temple walls. Farmers, shepherds, and craftsmen all contributed to the temple economy, for feeding the gods was seen as the most essential task of all. To you, listening now, it may sound curious. The idea that the gods required literal meals of bread, beer, and meat set before their statues each day. But in Mesopotamian thought, ritual sustenance was not symbolic, it was necessary. Neglect the offerings, and the gods might abandon their temples, leaving the city vulnerable to famine, plague, or invasion. This intertwining of myth and daily survival shaped every aspect of life. When a river flooded unexpectedly or a drought scorched the crops, people did not simply see a natural disaster, they saw the displeasure of the gods. When invaders threatened from the mountains or deserts, it was interpreted as a cosmic imbalance, perhaps punishment for neglecting ritual duties. The world was fragile, forever teetering between order and chaos, and only through constant ritual could balance be maintained. Even the king's military campaigns were framed in mythological terms. Victories were presented not just as triumphs of human arms, but as acts of divine will.
A king might inscribe on a clay tablet that Marduk or Ishtar had marched with his armies, ensuring victory. Failure, too, could be explained. Perhaps a rival had momentarily won the god's favor, or perhaps a ritual had been neglected. But kingship was not eternal. The Sumerian king list, one of the oldest documents we have, records dynasties stretching back into mythical time. Some reigns are listed as lasting thousands of years, a blending of myth and memory, before shortening into more realistic spans. But the list also reveals a sobering truth. Kingship did not stay in one place forever. It was transferred city to city as power shifted. Uruk, Ur, Kish, Lagash, each held the mantle of kingship for a time before it passed elsewhere. This shifting was not random, but understood as divine will, a reminder that no city, however mighty, could claim permanent supremacy. When you reflect on this, you begin to see how deeply myth infused every layer of life. A farmer digging irrigation canals was not merely laboring for food, he was participating in the divine order. A priest lighting incense in a temple was not just performing a ritual, he was sustaining the very existence of the gods within the city. A king building a ziggurat was not merely constructing a monument, he was anchoring heaven to earth, ensuring that his people remained under divine protection. But what of the ordinary person? The potter shaping jars, the shepherd guiding flocks, the woman weaving wool in a dim mud brick house. Did they feel themselves part of this cosmic drama, or were they simply enduring the demands placed upon them? Archaeological evidence offers small glimpses: household shrines with tiny clay figurines, personal prayers scratched into tablets, charms and amulets carried for protection. These reveal a world where belief was not abstract or distant, but intimate and constant. In this paradox lay the meaning of life for the Mesopotamians. The fragility of this balance perhaps explains why their myths returned again and again to the themes of chaos, flood, and renewal. Order was never permanent. Kings rose and fell, cities flourished and crumbled, temples were built and abandoned. Just as the rivers gave life and then destroyed, so too did history flow in cycles of prosperity and ruin. And so the myths of creation were not simply stories of the past, they were reminders of the present and warnings for the future. If the gods could fashion the world from the corpse of Tiamat, they could also let it slide back into chaos. If kingship could descend from heaven, it could just as easily be withdrawn. The question that lingered was always the same: how long would order last, and what would bring about its end?
Among the most powerful and enduring Mesopotamian myths is that of the flood, a tale so influential that echoes of it resound in later traditions across the world, from the Hebrew Bible to Greek mythology. To understand why the flood occupied such a central place, you must first recall the environment in which these stories were told. The rivers, mighty and unpredictable, were the lifeblood of Mesopotamia. They fed the canals, sustained the crops, and allowed cities to thrive. But they could also rise with sudden violence, sweeping away villages, drowning livestock, and turning fertile land into ruin. To live in Mesopotamia was to live under constant threat of catastrophe. It is no wonder, then, that the flood became a central motif in their mythology, a divine act that mirrored the very real terrors people faced. The best-known version comes to us from the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest surviving works of literature. In this tale, the flood is recounted not as a primary story, but as a memory revealed to Gilgamesh by the immortal sage Utnapishtim. You may recall that Gilgamesh, shaken by the death of his companion Enkidu, wandered the earth seeking immortality.
His journey eventually brought him across the waters of death to Utnapishtim, the man who had survived the flood and been granted eternal life by the gods. Utnapishtim's story is stark and haunting. Long ago, he says, the gods grew weary of humankind. The reasons vary in different versions. Some say humanity had become too noisy, disturbing the gods with their endless chatter, while others suggest the gods felt overburdened by the sheer multitude of humans. Whatever the cause, the decision was made. The world of humans would be wiped away in a flood. But one god, Ea, also called Enki in Sumerian tradition, took pity on Utnapishtim. Through a dream or whispered message, Ea warned him to build a great boat. The instructions were detailed: measure its length and breadth, seal it with bitumen, bring aboard your family, your possessions, and pairs of animals of every kind. Utnapishtim obeyed, working day and night, while neighbors mocked him for his strange labor. When the rains came, they did not stop. The heavens roared, the earth split open, and torrents covered the land. For 6 days and 6 nights the storm raged until all living things outside the boat were destroyed. On the 7th day, the waters began to recede. Utnapishtim released a dove, then a swallow, and finally a raven. When the raven did not return, he knew the earth was drying. His boat came to rest on a mountain, and there he made an offering to the gods. Here the story takes a striking turn. The gods, seeing the destruction they had unleashed, were filled with regret. They gathered around the smoke of Utnapishtim's sacrifice, drawn like flies, lamenting the devastation of humanity. The goddess Ishtar wept, mourning the loss of her people, swearing never again to consent to such ruin. Ea rebuked the other gods for their recklessness, reminding them that justice could have been served by lesser punishments, plague, famine, wild beasts, instead of total destruction. In response, the chief god Enlil, who had ordered the flood, was compelled to relent. He granted Utnapishtim and his wife immortality, setting them apart from the rest of humanity as a living reminder of the flood. Yet this gift was double-edged, for while Utnapishtim gained eternal life, he was also condemned to live forever in exile, far from the world of men. When Gilgamesh hears this tale, he realizes the futility of his quest. Immortality was not meant for humanity. It was a rare exception, born of catastrophe, not a destiny to be sought. And so the flood story becomes more than a tale of destruction. It is a meditation on the boundaries between gods and mortals, on the inevitability of death, and on the fragile gift of survival. But Gilgamesh's version was not the only flood myth. The Atrahasis epic, an older Babylonian poem, offers another account. In this telling, the gods first attempt to control humanity through lesser measures: disease, drought, and famine. Each time the god Ea intervenes, advising Atrahasis on how to appease or resist these plagues. Only when these measures fail do the gods turn to the flood. Once again, Ea warns Atrahasis, who builds a boat and preserves life. The themes remain the same: divine anger, human survival, and divine regret. But the focus on repeated punishments reflects a deeper truth. For the Mesopotamians, disaster was never final. It came in cycles, again and again, always testing the resilience of human beings. And perhaps this is why the flood stories endured for so long. They were not simply explanations of a single catastrophe, but allegories for the precariousness of life itself. Every farmer knew that a single season of failed crops could bring famine. Every family feared the sudden rise of the river that could destroy their village. The flood was not only a myth of the distant past, it was a mirror of daily existence, transformed into cosmic drama. When you hear these tales in the quiet of the night, it is easy to imagine the people who first told them. Families gathered in dim houses of mud brick, listening as an elder recited the story by the glow of a lamp. Outside, perhaps the river was rising, the air heavy with rain. The story would have brought both fear and comfort, a reminder that catastrophe was not random, but part of a pattern, overseen by gods, and that survival, though rare, was always possible. Yet these stories also left questions unresolved. Why would the gods, who created humanity to serve them, later seek to destroy their creation? Why would immortality be given to one man and his wife, but denied to all others? Was survival a matter of virtue, of divine favor, or of chance? These ambiguities lingered, unsettling and unresolved, leaving listeners to reflect on their own place in a world that seemed both fragile and eternal. The flood myths remind us that in Mesopotamian thought, humanity's relationship with the divine was always precarious. The gods might bless, but they might also destroy, and no explanation was entirely satisfactory. Life was uncertain, survival never guaranteed, and death unavoidable. And yet, through resilience, memory, and ritual, humans endured.
The flood stories lingered as a reminder that life could be swept away at any moment, yet Mesopotamian mythology did not end with destruction. The final threads of their myths often turn towards continuity, memory, and the role of humanity in maintaining balance. To live in Mesopotamia was to live under constant tension, between river and desert, between fertility and famine, between the favor of the gods and their anger. And through this tension came the stories that allowed people to explain their world. In the centuries that followed, the myths of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria did not vanish. They were retold, rewritten, and reshaped, passed down through temple hymns, epic poetry, and the etched words of clay tablets. By the time scribes recorded the stories of Gilgamesh or Atrahasis, these tales were already ancient, carrying the weight of generations. Imagine a young apprentice scribe, hunched over a tablet, pressing signs into wet clay with a reed stylus by the flickering light of an oil lamp. Each stroke preserved not only words, but also fragments of memory, memories of gods who had once walked among mortals, of heroes who had challenged the boundaries of death, of floods that had nearly erased all life. It is easy to think of mythology as distant, but for the Mesopotamians, it was woven into daily life. Temples were not simply places of worship, but centers of economy, law, and learning. A farmer offering grain at the temple of Ishtar was not just making a ritual gift, he was taking part in a larger narrative, acknowledging that his harvest depended on divine favor. A king boasting of his victories in stone inscriptions was not merely preserving history, he was aligning himself with divine myths, claiming a role in the eternal struggle between order and chaos. Even lullabies sung to children sometimes carried echoes of myth, promising divine protection through the long, uncertain nights. One of the enduring themes of Mesopotamian myth was the idea of divine kingship. Kings were not gods, but they were chosen by the gods to rule. This gave rulers both authority and heavy responsibility. If crops failed or enemies triumphed, it could be seen as a sign that the king had lost divine favor. Thus, myths became political tools, reinforcing the belief that earthly order mirrored divine will. The Epic of Gilgamesh itself may have served such a purpose, reminding rulers that even the greatest king must face mortality, and that his legacy lies not in eternal life, but in the works he leaves behind. Another important theme was the struggle between order and chaos.
embodied not only in myths like Marduk's battle with Tiamat, but also in the constant maintenance of irrigation canals, fields, and cities. The Mesopotamians understood that chaos was never truly defeated. It lurked always at the edges, in floods, in droughts, in invasions. Their myths reflected this truth, showing gods who fought chaos again and again, just as humans had to do in their daily lives. Yet, for all their harshness, the myths also carried a sense of deep melancholy. The gods were powerful but fickle, often distant or indifferent to human suffering. Immortality was denied to mortals, except in rare and strange cases. Death was unavoidable, and the afterlife was a shadowy realm of dust and silence. But within this bleak vision lay a quiet acceptance. Life was fragile, fleeting, and therefore precious. The stories did not promise eternal bliss, but they did teach resilience, the need to endure, to remember, and to continue. As the centuries passed, these myths spread far beyond Mesopotamia. The flood story, as we have seen, echoes in the story of Noah in the Hebrew Bible, and perhaps even in Greek myths of Deucalion and Pyrrha. The theme of a hero seeking immortality reappears in countless traditions, from Homer's epics to medieval legends. Even today, when you hear a story of a great battle between order and chaos, or of a hero who defies death only to discover the limits of mortality, you are hearing distant echoes of Mesopotamian voices. And yet, it is important to remember that for the Mesopotamians, these stories were not only entertainment or allegory. They were survival guides, maps of meaning for a world that was both bountiful and dangerous. To tell the story of the flood was to prepare for the next rising of the river. To sing of Gilgamesh was to accept the inevitability of death while still finding purpose in life. To recite the names of the gods was to remind oneself of the fragile bond between human and divine. In the end, the myths of Mesopotamia do not offer simple comfort. They leave questions unanswered, truths unresolved. Why must humans serve the gods? Why must death come to all, regardless of wealth or virtue? Why do the gods sometimes act with cruelty and sometimes with compassion? These questions lingered in the minds of ancient listeners, just as they linger for us today. Perhaps that is why these stories still hold power, because they reflect not only the world of the past, but also the enduring uncertainties of the human condition. As you drift into rest, imagine the quiet of an ancient city at night. The streets are silent, the hearth fires burn low, and above the mud brick walls, the stars gleam over the wide rivers. Somewhere, a priest chants a hymn to Ishtar. Somewhere else, a child hears the tale of Gilgamesh before sleep. The world is fragile, uncertain, yet filled with meaning. And the myths live on, not only in tablets and ruins, but in the minds of those who tell and retell them across centuries, across cultures, across time. And so we come to the end of Story 1, Mesopotamian Mythology. We have walked with gods, kings, and heroes, witnessed floods and battles, and listened to voices that speak across thousands of years. The story closes not with a final answer, but with a reminder that history,